Hello, everyone. I'm Cedric. Today, I'm very happy to share with all of you our paper to EACL 2023 entitled PANCETTA, Phoneme-Aware Neural Completion to Elicit Tongue Twisters Automatically. The main task we're trying to solve is tongue twister generation. But first, what are tongue twisters? These are sentences which are both meaningful and difficult to pronounce. For example, we see the sentence, "She sells seashells by the seashore." You notice that this sentence is meaningful, it's fluent, it makes sense, but at the same time, it's also difficult to pronounce. In the real world, tongue twisters are very useful because they're used as aids in speech therapy, as well as in English for foreign language instructional settings. However, these are very difficult to generate for language models because the way language models are trained with objectives such as next token prediction or masked language modeling, these do not take into consideration the way that words are pronounced. And so the concept of articulatory or phonetic difficulty is something that's very difficult for a standard language model to capture. So how do we approach this? We had this idea of leveraging phonemes. Now, if you've looked at the dictionary before, phonemes are basically these characters which tell you how specific words should be pronounced. An example here, we have "she sells seashells" and the phoneme version of that phrase. Now, our idea was that if we could have a language model that can work on the phoneme space, then we'd be able to do tongue twister generation in a way that's both meaningful and also high quality in the way that the tongue twisters are difficult to pronounce. In terms of the tasks, we consider two settings for tongue twister generation. The first setting is, given the first few words, we want to generate a continuation that's a tongue twister. An example would be if the first few words are "a good cook," the continuation would be "a good cook who could cook as many cookies as a good cook who could cook cookies." We call this task tongue twister prompt. The second task is, given a few keywords, we want to generate the tongue twister related to those given keywords. It doesn't necessarily need to exactly contain those keywords, but they have to be related. An example would be if we have the keywords blood and death, and the tongue twister bad dead bed bugs bleed bug blood. We call this setting tongue twister keyword. In terms of our data set, we scrape our own data set, which we call Tongue Twister Corp. This consists of 644 unique English tongue twisters from various online sources. And lastly, we create a non-tongue twister version of each tongue twister using synonym substitution, using WordNet synonyms. So how we do this is we extract all the nouns, verbs, and adjectives in the sentences. Then we use WordNet to identify synonyms which share the same part of speech, and then do the substitution. So in the first example on the right, we see, for example, little was substituted with small, witch with enchantress, and switched with exchange. The main goal of why we're doing this is so that we can have tongue twister and non-tongue twister pairs such that they share the same semantics, but one of them is a tongue twister and one of them is not. This will be used later on when we train one of our models. The models we propose, we call them PANCETTA. There are two variants of PANCETTA, namely PANCETTA Phoneme, or PANCETTA P, and PANCETTA Joint, or PANCETTA J. We compare these PANCETTA models with two baselines, namely grapheme-based methods and style transfer methods. Now, if you look at the table at the bottom, you can see that we have outlined these four methods together with some examples and some descriptions. And in the next few slides, I'll be going through each of these methods one by one. Before that, I'd like to highlight that the PANCETTA methods leverage phoneme representations, as I was mentioning earlier, while the baselines do not. The first method we'll be talking about is grapheme-based methods, and this is the most straightforward. We're basically treating the task as a sequence task. So for example, if you have the first few words, "she sells," we just treat it as a completion task. She sells seashells on the seashore, and hope that by training on tongue twisters, the model will be able to learn also to generate tongue twisters. Now, the possible downside is that this may not necessarily be the case. The task of tongue twisterizing a sentence may be too difficult for a model to capture simply by training with these graphemes. As I mentioned earlier, this is because without access to phoneme representations, it's difficult for the models to really have this concept of the pronunciation of words. So next is style transfer methods. For this, the first step is to train a tongue twisterizer model. The tongue twisterizer model uses the tongue twister and non-tongue twister pairs that I mentioned earlier. These are the ones that we created using synonym substitution. And we train the model to convert from non-tongue twisters to tongue twisters. And so during inference, we first do a sentence completion as we normally do with a standard language model. So for example, she sells, we do a sentence completion to get she sells things on the beach. And then we use the tongue twisterizer model to convert from a non-tongue twister into a tongue twister. So she sells things on the beach is converted to she sells seashells on the seashore. So you can notice this is sort of the reverse process of the synonym substitution that we were doing earlier, where we're this time converting from something that's not a tongue twister to something that is a tongue twister. This, of course, similar to the grapheme-based method we mentioned earlier, also suffers from the same issue that it doesn't have access to the phoneme representations. And so we're not sure how well it's actually going to do in terms of the pronunciations. Now we go to the PANCETTA models. First, we talk about PANCETTA P. And this uses a language model in the phoneme space. How this works is we pre-train a phoneme language model using Wikitext data. So we take articles from Wikitext, we phonemize them, and we train them using GPT-2's training objectives and architecture. We train these from scratch. Basically, it's a causal language model, so it's going to predict the next phoneme in the sequence. So now that we have this pre-trained phoneme language model, we fine-tune this model using phoneme representations of tongue twisters, so that instead of just predicting the next token in a normal phoneme way, we predict the next phoneme token that's going to give us a good tongue twister. And during inference, what happens is we first convert from grapheme to phoneme, and then we use the phoneme language model to complete it and generate a phoneme version of a tongue twister, and then we convert that phoneme tongue twister back to graphemes. Here we have a more concrete example together with a diagram. If we start with the first few words, Peter Piper, we first convert it to phonemes, as we see here. We feed it to the GPT-2 phoneme language model, and it's going to give a full phoneme tongue twister. And then we convert it back to graphemes using a BART-based phoneme to grapheme translator, which we also train using Wikitext data. One big downside for PANCETTA P is that we need to do pre-training for the phoneme language model. And so we cannot leverage a large-scale pre-training that is present in these standard language models such as GPT-2, because we have to do this pre-training from scratch on our own in the phoneme space. And so in order to have the best of both worlds, meaning having both phoneme representation and being able to leverage the pre-training, we propose PANCETTA J. This is actually quite simple. We just do a standard sequence-to-sequence training using a GPT model. But the main difference is that we consider 4 types of representations all at the same time. These 4 representations are grapheme to grapheme, phoneme to phoneme, grapheme to phoneme, and phoneme to grapheme. And we just use special tokens to indicate which modality the current sentence is. So if you look at the table at the bottom, we have some examples. If you notice the first example, she sells, it becomes she sells seashells on the seashore. And the last example, the grapheme to grapheme and phoneme to phoneme, these are sentence completion tasks, while the grapheme to phoneme and phoneme to grapheme are translation tasks, where we switch from one modality to another. This is a more concrete example. We see the 4 different types of modalities that we have here, together with the custom tokens that we use to indicate which task. We also have a separator token to separate the graphemes and the phonemes. And all these are trained in a multitask manner. They're all trained at the same time. And the idea is that by training all these at the same time, the language models is able to then learn these different representations, so that during test time, we can just feed in the grapheme and it's able to complete it in a way that it's able to also consider the phonemes internally, but the interface is all just based on graphemes. For the evaluation, we consider both automatic and human evaluation. For automatic evaluation, we have phonetic difficulty. So for this one, we train a classifier or a scorer using the tongue twister and non-tongue twister pairs from our data set. We have fluency, which uses GPT-2 perplexity. And for the keyword task, we use keyword relevance, which is based on embeddings. Specifically, we take the BERT score between the concatenated keywords and the generated tongue twister. For human evaluation, it's much of the same. We have phonetic difficulty as well as fluency. For the results for the automatic metrics, we see that the phoneme-aware methods, meaning PANCETTA P and PANCETTA J, work very well in terms of phonetic difficulty for both tongue twister prompt and tongue twister keyword. However, the fluency may favor more non-tongue twister models, and this kind of makes sense because tongue twisters are generally not so fluent because they're unnatural, right? Even if you look at the ground truth examples here, the fluency is a bit high and lower fluency is desirable. However, what's important is that the fluency is within a reasonable range, so we know that the generations are still coherent. And most importantly, of course, the phonetic difficulty is very high for these PANCETTA models. For human evaluations, these were done on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest. And once again, in terms of the results, they're very similar in that for phonetic difficulty, the PANCETTA models, because they're able to consider the phonemes, are able to perform really well. And lastly, we have some examples here of the generations. So the first two examples on the left, the ones at the top, are from the tongue twister prompt task, and the two examples at the bottom are from the tongue twister's keyword task. And what I'd like to point out is that for PANCETTA P and PANCETTA J, they're really able to use a wide variety of tongue twister techniques. This includes rhymes, for example, grape, crepe, and crate. In the first example, there's alliteration, alternating final sounds, alternating initial sounds, and also repetition. And it's also able to mix and match and combine these examples all in a single sentence. Meanwhile, baselines often rely too much on alliteration. If we look at the first example, for example, for the G to G, the pirates pirated the pepper pot. It's not that difficult to pronounce. It relies too much on alliteration, as I mentioned. The PANCETTA models are also able to generate proper nouns, such as if you look at the third example, PANCETTA P, it's able to use, for example, the word Donna or needles nude. These are proper nouns, and they help enhance the sentence and make a better tongue twister. And lastly, PANCETTA P may sometimes end abruptly. For example, the third example, it ends in "and the need?" question mark. So that's quite unnatural. While PANCETTA J generally sounds smoother, this is likely because PANCETTA P, we have to train our own phoneme language models from scratch, while for PANCETTA J, it's able to leverage already existing pre-training. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for listening. We invite all of you to read our paper, look at our dataset and our code. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. We're very happy to talk about our paper. Thank you.